He would be responsible for the largest single British military defeat in history. Criticised for weak leadership, arrogance and indecisiveness, this general would take the blame for the fall of Fortress Singapore. But who was this man? Was he truly at fault or simply a convenient scapegoat? Today we're going to look at the life, campaigns and most importantly the medals of Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Percival. And we're going to do it right here in Singapore. Well, actually, we're going to be back and forth between Singapore and the man cave. But hopefully you get what I mean. So, how did the destiny of a single man become so tightly bound to the fate of the British Empire's greatest outpost? Why was Arthur Percival, a quiet, methodical officer rather than a flamboyant battlefield commander, chosen to defend Singapore in the first place, which was the keystone of Britain's power in the Far East? Was Percival's rise the result of brilliance, nepotism, or simply down to luck? And when the war finally came crashing down on the Malayan Peninsula, was Percival shaping events or being swept along by forces far beyond his control? We'll find out. To bring you this video, I've battled creepy crawlies, fearsome reptiles, and more than a few dangerous beasts. If you'd like to support the channel and dive deeper into the far-flung campaigns of British India and beyond, including looking at one of the most fascinating Victorian-era medals, consider picking up a copy of Class of Courage. The Amazon link is in the channel description. Arthur Ernest Percival was born in 1887 into a middle-class Hertfordshire family and educated at Rugby, where he was an average student but a keen sportsman with an early interest in soldiering. On graduating from school, he would move to London, where he worked as a clerk at a merchant's within the City of London. His life was pretty uneventful until the age of 26 when World War I broke out, and he joined the army. Enlisting as a private in the Officer Training Corps, he would soon be promoted to the rank of second lieutenant. By 1915, he was serving in France with the 7th Bedfordshire Regiment, a Kitchener Army unit raised in September 1914. Percival survived early fighting in the Somme, but was badly wounded by shrapnel later in the year whilst leading an assault at the Schwaben Redoubt, earning a military cross. His citation read, "During the advance, he showed fine leadership and determination under heavy shell and machine gun fire. He worked unceasingly with absolute disregard of danger in completing every detail in the consolidation of the captured position." In October 1916, Percival secured a full-time or regular commission with the Essex Regiment. Remember that name, as it will crop up shortly. Recovering from his wounds, Percival rapidly rose through the ranks, becoming a battalion commander by 1917 and briefly commanding a brigade in 1918. During the German Spring Offensive, he led a decisive counterattack that saved French artillery, earning both the Croix de Guerre and the Distinguished Service Order. His DSO citation noted power of command and knowledge of tactics. Percival finished the war highly regarded as an efficient and effective commander and was recommended for Staff College. However, in 1919, he delayed his studies to volunteer for the North Russia intervention, serving as a second-in-command of the 45th Royal Fusiliers at Archangel. During one operation, his men captured 400 Red Army troops, and it earned him a bar to his DSO. Here's where Percival's career takes a more interesting turn. In 1920, he's sent to Ireland, then in the grip of rebellion. Serving in the post-war army as a major, Percival was a key intelligence officer for the 1st Battalion Essex Regiment, which was stationed in County Cork in the south of the country. Cork would witness some of the most brutal fighting during the Irish Rebellion, later known as the Irish War of Independence. And of all the British regular units involved in the rebellion, the Essex would gain a particularly harsh reputation amongst the Irish. In Cork, the Essex would be a thorn in the side of the local IRA 3rd Brigade and be accused of using extreme methods, including torture of suspected IRA members. As the IO or intelligence officer of the Essex, Percival would be responsible for many of the raids and operations conducted by the battalion. Percival would be deeply unpopular in Ireland and was remembered by many IRA veterans as an aggressive and relentless opponent who showed excessive zeal against the rebels. In February 1921, during one raid, Percival himself would shoot dead an IRA volunteer who was recuperating in a house after a routine medical operation. Seeing British soldiers appear, the IRA suspect attempted to flee, and allegedly Percival shot him in the back whilst he was running away. According to the rebels, Major Percival stood out for his violent, sadistic behaviour towards IRA prisoners, suspects and innocent civilians. He also participated in reprisals, burning farms and businesses in response to IRA attacks. In West Cork, Percival adopted IRA flying column tactics himself, leading large mobile columns that moved cross-country, occupied farmhouses at night, and set ambushes away from roads. While this made life harder for dispatch riders and guerrilla operations, IRA intelligence networks usually tracked his movements closely and would tip off intended targets before Percival's men arrived. The IRA would also target Percival's men for ambush themselves, and during his time there, Percival would actually receive an OBE for gallantry shown when one convoy he was travelling in was ambushed by Euston Cross. This award was one of the first gazetted for the conflict. When speaking of the rationale behind the awards, Secretary of State at the time, Winston Churchill, stated, "Why? Because they are shot down by Irish rebels and not by Mesopotamian rebels, should they be excluded from consideration," speaking of British soldiers. Percival became so infamous to the IRA that a bounty of £1,000 was placed on his head, and there would be several assassination attempts planned against him. Tom Barry, a West Cork IRA commander, said of Percival, "The brigade, OC and I went to Bandon to attempt to shoot Major Percival." This officer was easily the most viciously anti-British of all serving British officers. He was tireless in his attempts to destroy the spirit of the people and organisation of the IRA. Day and night he raided homes and arrested numbers, some of whom had no connection with the IRA. One planned assassination operation even followed him home on leave to England, although it was unsuccessful. On another occasion in Ireland, the IRA had observed Percival's pattern of life and planned to assassinate him as he left his barracks to walk to a routine evening dinner at a house located outside the military base. Percival was lucky that evening, as he had cancelled his normal routine intended dinner to go out raiding suspected IRA homes. Barry recalled, "Disappointed, we trudged out of Bandon back to our headquarters, little thinking that Major Percival, who was to fail so dismally against the West Cork IRA, was later to become the commander of the pathetic surrender at Singapore. We could not foresee that our target of the night, as Lieutenant General Percival, Commander-in-Chief of 90,000 British troops, would surrender himself, his army, and many months' supplies after a skirmish and without a real fight to a much smaller force of Japanese." Later, when briefly being held as a suspect, Barry described an encounter with Percival. "I looked curiously at Percival as he approached. Dressed in a tunic and shorts, he gripped a Colt revolver in his right hand. The cruelty of his set face was accentuated by 2 buck teeth, which showed like small fangs at either side of this bitter mouth. His hard eyes darting suspiciously from side to side, resting on me momentarily as he came up. Interestingly, it's believed that another British officer serving in Ireland at the same time with Percival, and who we've covered before, Bernard Montgomery, had a significant influence on how Percival conducted the war. Montgomery was a brigade major and also stationed alongside Percival. He wrote to Percival stating, "My own view is that to win a war of this sort, you must be ruthless. Oliver Cromwell or the Germans would have settled it in a very short time. Nowadays, public opinion precludes such methods." Between the wars, Percival emerged as a highly regarded staff officer, and he attended Staff College in Camberley between 1923 and 24, impressing his instructors and marking him out for accelerated promotion. Later serving in West Africa with the Nigeria Regiment and received promotion to Lieutenant Colonel. He was then sent to Royal Naval College in Greenwich, London for further professional education. Although an army officer, Percival attended the Royal Naval College because it trained future senior commanders in naval strategy, maritime power and imperial defence, with a strong emphasis on joint service operations essential for overseas warfare in the British Empire. Later, he would become an instructor at Staff College and came under the mentorship of Sir John Dill, who rated Percival intellectually outstanding despite a lack of commanding presence. With Dill's support, Percival went on to command the 2nd Battalion Cheshire Regiment, serving in Malta and then attend Imperial Defence College. Physically, you can see Percival comes across as no alpha male. Although no doubting his personal courage as a young officer, throughout his career, reports would indicate a lack of command presence or decisiveness at strategic levels. Although arguably well suited to chasing the IRA through hedgerows or administrative and operational roles, as we shall see, when faced with the demands of higher command and strategic decision-making, Percival often appeared out of his depth. During the interwar period, Malaya was seen as a vital economic hub in the British Empire, and at the time it produced roughly over half the world's tin ore and natural rubber. Singapore was a vital commercial port functioning as a main export gateway for Malaya's raw materials and a key link in global shipping networks, serving as a vital coaling station, warehouse centre and financial hub. Since its establishment by the British in the early 19th century, Singapore had attracted a diverse and multicultural population that was focused on trade. Of note for later, Singapore was also home to a large Chinese community. The rise of the Japanese in the early 20th century and their more militaristic outlook after World War I was seen as a threat to British interests in the region, including Malaya. The Japanese Empire, short on natural resources, viewed both Malaya and Singapore as vital to the expansion of their empire, known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. With Anglo-Japanese relations deteriorating in the 1930s, the British government decided to build a regional modern naval base to counter the Japanese, and the strategic location of Singapore made it a natural choice. At the same time, senior British officers were tasked with assessing the island's vulnerabilities, and somewhat ironically, Arthur Percival would be one of them. From 1936 until 1938, Percival served in Malaya as Chief of Staff to General Dobbie, where he demonstrated foresight by recognising that Singapore was vulnerable to attack from the north. Percival was allegedly quoted as saying, "The Japanese could burgle Malaya by the back door." He warned of a possible Japanese landing in Thailand, supporting plans for fixed defences in southern Johor, and later believed his analysis closely matched the Japanese approach in 1941. That's great in hindsight, isn't it? Returning to Britain in 1938, he was temporarily promoted to brigadier and appointed to the General Staff at Aldershot, entering the final stage of his pre-war career. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy's long-delayed modern naval base was finally completed at Sembawang in 1938, at a staggering cost of £60 million. Furthermore, a series of fortifications and gun emplacements would be built to defend Singapore and the naval base. They would be located in the south of the island, including locations at Fort Pasir Panjang and Siloso Point on Sentosa Island. British planners assumed any major attack would be amphibious and naturally come from the sea. They were to be proved wrong. One of the main British artillery emplacements here in Singapore on Sentosa Island was Fort Siloso, which we'll check out now. These coastal defences consisted of huge 15-inch guns designed to sink ships, as well as 9 and 6-inch pieces. The guns were primarily supplied with armour-piercing shells, which were excellent when used against maritime targets, but more ineffective against land-based threats. Just under 30 or so of these guns would be used to guard the approaches to Singapore. By 1939, many of the guns had been upgraded so that they could swivel and face inland. These coastal artillery defences would be touted by British politicians, including Churchill, as the bedrock of Fortress Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East. A combined operations headquarters was also constructed to coordinate command and control in the event of war with Japan. Built in 1936 beneath Fort Canning Hill, this bomb-proof underground complex, 9 metres below ground, comprised of 29 rooms, and it became known as the Battle Box. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Percival was given a job as the Chief Staff Officer to General Sir John Dill in France. He was soon promoted to Acting Major General and briefly commanded the 43rd Wessex Infantry Division in early 1940. After Dunkirk, Percival became Assistant Chief of the Imperial General Staff at the War Office before requesting a return to field command and taking over the 44th Home Counties Infantry Division in Britain. He would then be selected for the Far East. In July 1941, Percival was placed in command of British forces in Malaya. When deploying to theatre, his immediate superior would be Commander of British forces in the Far East, Sir Robert Brooke Popham, known as Brookie. Brookie would be criticised for failing to alert the British government just how bad things were and vulnerable the state of affairs was in the Far East. He would be accused of complacency and a lack of a sense of urgency. By 1939, the British understood any successful defence of Singapore and Malaya would be impossible without the presence of a substantial air force. Commanders on the ground estimated around 580 aircraft would be needed for the defence of Burma and Southeast Asia. Army Command said 330 were needed. By December 1941, only 265 aircraft were deployed, with around 180 serviceable. Most of them were not modern Hurricanes or Spitfires, but second-rate fighters like the Buffalo. The American-built Brewster Buffalo fighter was a heavy, sluggish, poorly armed and fatally underpowered plane. Only Britain's desperate need for fighters led to the RAF purchasing 150 of them. Nicknamed Peanut Specials, they were deployed to the Far East. 60 of these would be based in Malaya and Singapore. Brooke Popham stated, "We can get on all right with the Buffaloes here. They are quite good enough for Malaya." There were also 24 even older Vickers torpedo bombers. The British also underestimated their foe, with the perception that the Japanese were little men with bad eyesight who couldn't fly planes well. In December 1940, Brooke Popham commented on some Japanese POWs that he had witnessed whilst on a recent tour to China. He stated, "I had a good close-up across the barbed wire of various subhuman specimens dressed in dirty grey uniforms, which, I was informed, were Japanese soldiers. If these represent the average of the Japanese army, the problems of their food and accommodation would be simple. But I cannot believe they would form an intelligent fighting force." To be fair though, the British weren't the only ones who suffered from prejudice at the time. Shortly after conquering Singapore, General Yamashita delivered a speech to local Chinese delegates telling them that whilst the Japanese were descended from gods, Europeans were the descendants of monkeys, as proved by Charles Darwin. And in Japanese propaganda, Europeans would be stereotyped as uncultured and clumsy barbarians. Singapore had been designed as a fortress, equipped with guns facing out to sea. It was not expected that an attack could come down the Malayan Peninsula. In spite of his previous assessments in the 1930s, in late 1941, when it was pointed out to Percival that he had no landward defences, he refused to build any, fearing it might cause the people to lose confidence in the authorities. Percival declared, "I believe the defences of the sort you want to throw up are bad for the morale of troops and civilians." Clearly, Percival was not a man to rock the boat. The result was that the Japanese encountered no effective line of defences at any stage in their conquest of Singapore. Furthermore, there was not a single tank in the entire theatre of operations for the British. Yet Percival did not urgently press for any more armour. The British also assumed the American fleet would come to their aid from Pearl Harbor in the event of any future Japanese attack. Percival, just prior to going out to Singapore, would also receive a companion of the Order of the Bath at the beginning of July 1941. In the years before World War II, the British had been complacent in planning and preparation for any potential attack by the Japanese. In late 1941, Field Marshal Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of India, visited Singapore and wrote, "My impressions were that the whole atmosphere in Singapore was completely unwarlike, that they did not expect a Japanese attack and were very far from being keyed up to war pitch." The Field Marshal was horrified by the mentality of those supposed to be in control, later noting a lack of vigour in peacetime training, cumbersome tactical planning, lack of initiative and complacency. Percival had had 6 months to turn things around, but it appears made little effort or impression. It would seem that lethargy had gripped British leadership. Perhaps Percival and his staff were more concerned with a spot of golf and downing a few Singapore slings in the bar afterwards than having any sense of urgency. With increased intelligence reports of Japanese preparations for an invasion, the British finally upped their posture. The battle box would then become a hive of activity in preparation. As tensions mounted, in an example of indecision, on the 6th of December, about 2 days before the Japanese invasion, Percival decided that the battle box was too small for his staff and moved his HQ to nearby Sima Road. But they'd soon be back. The Japanese invasion of Malaya was led by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese 25th Army, who directed 3 main divisions throughout the campaign. He turned down 2 others, saying 3 was enough. The veteran 5th Division, the 18th Division, and the elite Imperial Guards Division. Many of these soldiers had had experience fighting in China. Amongst British forces, Percival's key subordinates were Major General Gordon Bennett, who led the Australian 8th Division, and Lieutenant General Lewis Heath, who commanded the Indian III Corps. A strong character, Bennett was noted as quick to anger and incapable of taking criticism. Heath was a capable Indian Army officer, but was hamstrung with poorly trained troops. With many of the best Indian regiments fighting overseas in North Africa, a significant amount of his regiments were green units and not yet thoroughly trained. Both generals, especially Bennett, would have strained relations with Percival during the campaign, clashing over strategy. Bennett was outspoken, abrasive, and openly critical of British leadership. Bennett frequently bypassed Percival's chain of command, and Percival struggled to rein him in. Thus, the 3 men never formed a cohesive command team. Prior to the invasion, against Heath's advice, Percival insisted on a forward defence spreading forces thinly across northern Malaya. Soon after the Japanese invasion, the so-called Jitra defence line would collapse in less than 24 hours. Heath blamed Percival's strategy for the disaster, leaving his men overexposed and ill-prepared. The Japanese force, embarking from Taiwan, landed at Kotobaru on the 8th of December 1941, less than an hour before the attack on Pearl Harbor due to the international dateline. The Royal Air Force had detected the convoy at sea, but Brooke Popham decided not to attack it as Japan was still in theory neutral and to wait until the Japanese had attacked friendly territory. The attack would place great strain on Brooke Popham, and suspected of nervous collapse, in a few weeks he would be replaced in late December, which was of no help to Percival. Once ashore, using bicycles and light armour, Japanese troops repeatedly outflanked British, Indian and Australian units that were poorly coordinated and often unprepared for jungle warfare. Bennett was not very popular with his men and was seen as brash and, it seems to me, a bit of a bully. British planners had believed the Malayan jungle to be largely impenetrable, like this example here in the footage. But in reality, much of it consisted of rubber plantations crisscrossed by roads, terrain that the Japanese exploited to devastating effect, moving swiftly forward on bikes. Clearly, British intelligence assessments had failed to keep pace with the reality on the ground. As an aside, whilst filming this bit of jungle footage, I almost walked into the world's most hideous looking large yellow and black spider. I've seen one or two camel spiders in my time, but compared to them, this critter seems like the King Kong of creepy crawlies. After being bitten to death earlier in the day by sandflies on Sentosa Beach whilst working on a video about German U-boat crews in the Far East, which hopefully I'll release in a few weeks or so, I think a bite off this arch-arachnid would have been icing on the cake. A first major target for the Japanese was the port of Penang, which was seen strategically and psychologically as a valuable objective. As a major port and naval base, it threatened Japanese supply lines and could support Allied air and naval operations in the Malacca Strait. On the 9th of December, the Japanese launched their first air raid against Butterworth Air Base, behind me across the water and the docks on Penang mainland. The first Japanese air raid targeting Penang city itself occurred on the 11th of December, and it consisted of 27 Japanese bombers. Many civilians were killed during that first air raid. The raids would continue for a further 2 days and target infrastructure, civilians and military installations. Controversially, Percival then decided to withdraw British and Commonwealth troops from Penang, as well as evacuate the European civilian population and then abandon the town to the Japanese. Once captured and occupied by the Japanese, Penang would be used as a major naval and air base. Penang's capture helped the Japanese secure the Strait of Malacca and support its southward advance, directly contributing to the fall of Singapore, and enabled the Japanese occupation of the city as the keystone of their control over Southeast Asia and access to the Indian Ocean. The Japanese then advanced rapidly down the peninsula. The general consensus of British leadership, including Percival, was that the Japanese would dare not attack Singapore from the north. This was due to an impenetrable jungle in Malaya. They thought only the south was vulnerable. This myth was now crumbling before Percival's eyes. In a desperate bid to stifle the Japanese advance, around 300 bridges were destroyed as the British retreated towards Singapore. This tactic had little effect. Percival said, "The rapidity in which the Japanese made temporary repairs were remarkable, even allowing for the fact that in most cases ample material was available near the bridge site." Percival was indecisive and rigid, sticking to textbook defence, while Yamashita rang rings around him with speed and surprise. During the Malayan campaign, Percival worked 18 hours a day, often travelling up north to the front and returning to Singapore on the same day. However, he would hold lengthy staff conferences in the forward area, rather than issuing clear, direct orders, and seemed to prefer building consensus among colleagues than issue specific orders, more reminiscent of a corporate boardroom than a battlefield. When learning that there was no detailed plan of withdrawal back to Singapore, Field Marshal Wavell flew out to visit Percival during the retreat and ensure that he wrote out and disseminated orders concerning the withdrawal. Ronald Lewis, in his book The Chief, essentially described Wavell as holding Percival's hand and standing over him whilst Percival wrote out the orders. In the final stages of the campaign, Percival moved his command headquarters to the battle box. As the Japanese grew nearer, communications personnel and other military staff would work relentlessly in the crowded, musty and claustrophobic rooms within the battle box. A signal officer recalled, "I saw General Percival a few times, walking in a corridor of the fort or through our signals centre. A gaunt, tall figure, looking utterly dejected and crushed. He was already a broken man. He was about to have his name attached to the worst defeat in the British Army's history." An officer commented in his diary in January 1942, "Percival was an uninspiring leader and rather gloomy." It took Malaya about 8 weeks to fall. Singapore's defences would collapse in just 7 days, when Japanese forces launched a rapid and well-coordinated assault. This assault came from the west, defying Percival's expectations that they would invade from the east. Consulting with his officers in the command centre, it's here Percival decided to surrender Singapore to the Japanese. On the morning of 15th of February 1942, Percival held a conference with his senior commanders in the battle box. Not wanting to turn Singapore into the Stalingrad of the Far East, Percival was concerned about the effects urban fighting would have on the civilian population, as well as a water shortage. After consulting all of his commanders, a decision was made to surrender Singapore to Japanese forces. Incredibly, in little more than a week, the Japanese Empire had seized one of the British Empire's most prized possessions. Churchill called it the greatest disaster and capitulation in British history. In the final hours of the fighting, desperate attempts were made to escape Singapore by sea. In the last moments of the fall of Singapore, approximately 44 ships attempted to escape Singapore harbour. However, only 4 managed to evade the Japanese blockade which was standing off the coast, and who sunk the remaining ships. Following the fall of Singapore on the 15th of February, Bennett handed over command of his division and escaped the island, claiming that he had left to pass on his knowledge about how to fight the Japanese. Although Percival was ultimately in command, it's worth asking whether any Allied general could realistically have performed much better under the circumstances. That said, Percival could have pressed far harder for more equipment, such as armoured support. Had he shown more confident leadership and garnered the respect of his commanders, with clearer command and control, improved jungle training for troops, and more aggressive defence, he could have made it much more difficult for the Japanese. That could have delayed Yamashita's advance and forced him to require further reinforcements. Wavell doesn't escape blame either, having tinkered and undermined Percival's defensive strategy in Johore and one part of the campaign. The Royal Navy also failed to adequately support the army, dispatching only the capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse without an aircraft carrier or adequate air cover. Both were sunk early in the campaign. Ultimately, the main blame should be accorded to pre-war politicians, including Churchill, who, even during the war, continued to prioritise aid to the Soviet Union over the defence of the Far East. In Singapore, the Japanese garrison army would occupy Fort Canning Hill and use it as their Singapore-based headquarters. The occupation of Singapore was harsh, with the local Chinese population being specifically targeted for brutal treatment. Some 20 to 30,000 of whom were identified as undesirables by the Japanese and executed. Some victims were allegedly executed here at the foot of this tree in Singapore. In total for both campaigns in Malaya and Singapore, around 130,000 Allied prisoners would fall into Japanese hands. Going into captivity with his troops, Percival was first interned in Singapore, then Formosa and Manchuria. In a twist of irony at the end of the war, at the signing of the Japanese surrender, General MacArthur invited Percival to stand behind him on the deck of the USS Missouri as he confirmed the terms of surrender with Japan. In later life, Percival was active in the Red Cross and served as life president of the Far East Prisoners of War Association before his passing in 1966. Percival's medals are Officer of the Order of St. John, given in the 1960s, likely for his charity work with the Red Cross. Companion of the Order of the Bath, awarded prior to Singapore. Military Cross in World War I. Order of the British Empire for the Island Ambush in 1921. Distinguished Service Order with Bar for World War I and the Russian intervention. French Croix de Guerre. Campaign and service medals are, I would assume, I've not seen this, but the 1914-15 Star, British War Medal and Victory Medal for World War I. Mention in dispatches. For World War II, a War Medal, a Pacific Star which was given to prisoners of war from Singapore, a 1939-45 Star, and the Defence Medal. Let me know if you think there's any more. No campaign medals were issued for the Irish War of Independence or the Russian intervention, as the British lost both. For this video, I really wanted to drill in on Percival's career and early life, which I think isn't really as covered thoroughly as the fall of Singapore, and you can watch plenty of other channels covering that topic on YouTube. I shall leave you with the Singapore sunset. Thanks for watching. I hope you found some value from this, and I'll see you in the next one.